with Drew Eddy. Drew is, if I can find where I wrote it. I know you're right there. I could just ask you to say who you are. Drew is with the Department of Bioengineering at Stanford University. Drew first fabless genetic engineering teaching. I can't read my own writing. He set up the first fabless, and you're going to have to explain what that is. Fabless genetic engineering teaching lab at Stanford. His team develops at Stanford. His team develops genetically encoded computers and redesigns genomes. He has co-founded the BioBricks Foundation, which is a public benefit charity. He is a member of the U.S. National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. Esquire named Drew as one of the 75 most influential people in the 21st century. So, so I think we're really privileged to have Drew in our midst. And Drew and Rebecca are going to do a thingy together. Now, are you going... How do you want to handle this? Do you just want to speak and have questions, or do you want to speak and then we'll field questions? Or
I've been so resonant with a lot of the conversations and questions thus far. I wanted to reflect those back, and then, if I can get through that alive, But I.
Well, you only have half an hour.
No, it'll be faster than that, and it's wonderful. My mom gets to imagine I hang out with George Clooney, which doesn't happen. So I've been asked to make some promises. And I am going to try and make promises. The promises that I can offer lead to ambiguity and opportunity, perhaps, but definitely ambiguity. Go next. So here are some promises I'll offer. If we all went away, and especially if I went away and my colleagues in science and engineering went away, that I know, I think the first two claims here are likely to remain true, that we're of a time where we'll continue to learn more about how natural living systems are. And then the second promise I'm willing to offer is we will continue to get, quote unquote, better at tinkering with living matter. And I put quotes around better because what better means is up to the person doing. Is it faster? Is it cheaper? Is it more? Is it none of that? Developing, and then the third promise, which is why I'm grateful to be here, developing and operationalizing whether it's you individually or your organization, your church, your biology strategy, will be increasingly important. I'm willing to make that claim. What's your biostrategy for yourself, your neighbors, your church, your organization? Can I go next? Never mind. It's cool. All right, wow, you're amazing. Totally amazing. Slide 3 then. So in the engineering school at Stanford, we have a biology strategy. This is our strategic document. You can download it online. It includes this question: how good can we get at engineering living matter? Biology, biological stuff, whether it's natural or moved into a laboratory. And we don't mean this as a rhetorical question. We mean this as an engineering school in the middle of what's known as Silicon Valley. And what we state is we foresee achieving ongoing improvements in our capacity to engineer living systems and thereby more powerfully harness life's intrinsic capacity for organizing atoms. And so on and so forth, and there's reasons to be excited about this as engineers. Now, as engineers, we have massive limitations. Our institution was founded, the Engineering School at Stanford was founded in 1925, so we're not even 100 years old, and the organizational architecture of the school reflects the world of 1925. For context, Sand Hill Road and venture capital didn't exist. You could be entrepreneurial by setting up a sawmill and cutting down redwood trees, right? Redwood City, just north of us, is known for redwood lumber. And so we're pretty bad at reflecting on things beyond engineering, connecting with aspects of humanity that don't involve humans. It's just not in the architecture of the organization by default. Okay, but we have our biostrategy, and it's world readable. What's yours? Next. I want to talk to synthetic biology specifically, and now after sort of 15 years in the business, what I think about as being unique and specific to synthetic biology that makes it worth paying attention to. On the top is a cartoon I draw to remind myself of how living systems operate in nature, from one generation to the next, direct physical descent from parent to offspring, and so on. Whether you're a microbe or a human or a plant, that's mostly what's going on. Now, what's coming up now is you can take a generation and change some of that stuff into information. And as Jim pointed out and others, primarily the genetic material. You can read out the DNA. And so you can take physical genetic material and quote unquote decode it into letters, A, T, C, and G. And that's sequencing in the genome projects and so on, the reading of the DNA. That's interchangeable with bits, which means it can be transmitted over the network. And then synthesis of DNA from scratch, printing DNA from scratch, as Jim introduced, allows you to reinstantiate the DNA from the information. And so these two technologies of reading and writing DNA make genetic material and genetic information interconvertible or fungible. And whenever that happens, history suggests other things change. So when entertainment media went from being, well, you had to perform the concerto with the musicians to experience the music, to you could have a recording that you could play back later somewhere else, to you had a digital recording on a CD, to all of a sudden you had digital files that could be transmitted over the internet. All of a sudden you can recompile the music in different locations in different ways without necessarily being connected to the original artist, right? That same leads to lots of economic changes, lots of property rights changes, lots of equity changes. That same sort of transition seems to be playing out now with living matter. So next, click 4 more times. These are the 5 reasons, one more, I believe synthetic biology is of relevance. The first, we haven't yet talked about, and it's not clear whether or not it can be done, but people are working on it. It's making organisms that are not derived from a natural lineage, what I'll call lineage agnostic organism. It's not yet been demonstrated, and some people say it can't be done, others are working on it and expect to maybe make some progress in the next decade. The next is what I was just elaborating. The biology, to the extent it can be connected to information, you get biology plus internet, and that, what that becomes, I don't know, I'll just placeholder call it the bionet. And so you could re-access biology in different locations. We saw this come up in the conversation about the Biodiversity Convention, and if you sequence something in one location, who can get access to that genetic information through the network? Most people are other people. This is about coordination of labor. Standards are a type of tool to allow people to reliably reuse measurement and materials. And the metrology of living matter has only recently been invested in. Metrology is the science of measurement. If you want to think about electronics, the resistance in a wire can be described using a unit called the ohm. The ohm is a human construct named after a guy called Ohm. And it's less than 200 years old as an idea, but not until you had that measurement unit could people really make sophisticated electrical systems. So coordination of labor through standards allows us to re-engage many other people potentially in working with biology. And part of synthetic biology is about standards and measurement and coordination of labor. And that allows us to have a response to this observation that even though we're all here, most people are not here. I'm only one person. You can learn a lot by building stuff. You take your car apart and understand how a car works. You can try and put a car back together and see if it works. And both are valid approaches to learning. A synthetic approach is a complementary approach to how science and biology is classically practiced, take things apart. So there's a lot being learned. And then the other thing, last one here, surprise. So I want to give you a couple examples of these and then reflect a different set of promises. Next, please. So here's a I teach Introduction to Bioengineering at Stanford to teenagers. Had about 170 students in the course last spring. This is the first question on the exam from 2 years ago. And I wanted to use this to illustrate some of the pacing that Jim stated, but to make it real in a different way, and also to touch upon some of the comments I've heard in passing around how does this relate to people in the context of churches and faith organizations. So when I first started teaching, the price of printing out 1 letter of DNA was $4 a letter. All right, at the time of this exam, it was less than 10 cents, about 100-fold cheaper. So it's about a 100-fold cost down over a period of 12 years. Now, unfortunately, so as a technologist, I like that. As an educator, the next thing I don't like, we charge a lot of money for people to come to our university. And instead of that price going down, that price is going up. And so the tuition at Stanford appears to double every 15 years. So the cost of printing DNA is dropping in half every other year, and the cost of going to Stanford is doubling every 15 years. And we're trying to prepare our students for thinking about a future, for developing their own biostrategies. And one of the hard things to do is understand what the future is going to be like. There's tremendous ambiguity. This is just an exercise. It's not a claim, but it's an exercise to help the students think about this. If the human genome's rounding up 4 billion letters, and these numbers up here are true, at what point in the future, if these trends continue, will the cost of going to Stanford for 1 year equal the cost of printing out the DNA and coding a human? It's 2 logarithms, the curves should intersect at some point in the future. And in 2015, the answer was 21 years in the future. And the exact number doesn't matter, but the approximate conclusion is within 1 human generation, the cost of attending a private university will approximately equal the cost of printing the DNA and coding a human. All right, so that's kind of interesting, which is, I would say, an understatement. And so we grade this on the math. Now look at the second part of the question. Let's say at some point in the future, you and a partner, potential parents, have to make a decision, an economic decision. Do you start saving up money for college? Or do you start to pay for tuition? Or do you start saving up money to print the genome and coding your offspring? And we grade this not on the answer, but on the reasoning, being open to any answer. This question splits the class. 60% say this is morally wrong. No way. It's not what it would mean to be a parent. The minority, but a significant minority, says Stanford's not that great. Cost-basis education is going to change. There'll be Khan Academy 10.0. And if there's any potential advantage to be realized for my offspring through this new technology, I want to have that option. I want to have optionality around this possibility. Next. Surprise. Well, here's its strange surprise. Everybody initially thinks of DNA as a biological thing, but I want you all of a sudden to think of DNA as an abiotic object, just a tape for recording information. So each base, there's 4 options, so that could store 2 bits of data. And suddenly George Church and my first PhD student, Sri Kasari, and others started showing up, and they said, we could take a book, we could convert the book from an analog piece of paper into a bit stream, and then from the 0s and 1s to the base stream, to the ATCG, and then we print out the DNA. We'll never put this DNA back in a life form. We'll just put it in a little tube, and that'll store the information encoding the book. And so that's what was done in this case. It was very expensive at the time. It takes about a month of DNA print time, and it costs about $10,000 to put a megabyte of data into DNA. But it turns out the storage markets for archival data storage are much bigger than the biotechnology markets. And it's looking like, from a capital flow perspective, the biggest driver of investment in DNA synthesis might have nothing to do with food or humans or biotech or genetic engineering. It might have to do with the librarians. And so what if the Vatican archive would like to become the largest capital purchaser of DNA? And think about the leverage that would imply around technologies that are otherwise dominated by totally different groups. Next. Synthetic aesthetics is a project where we took $250,000 US and we paid for artists and synthetic biologists to spend time together to see what they would do without us telling them ahead of time. So I want to give you a different type of surprise and then return to some illustrations of BioNet and some other aspects of why we imagine synthetic biology matters in different ways. And we called this project Synthetic Aesthetics because the words rhyme. That's about how sophisticated we are. Sissel Talas, a perfumer from Berlin, and Christina Agapakis, a microbiologist at Harvard, got together. They were one of the paired residencies. And they got interested in the odors of cheese. So they went to the cheese shop next to Harvard, and next they got core samples of the stinky cheese, and they recognized that the cheeses were made in small batches, the artisanal cheeses, and cheeses have microbes in the manufacturing process. And in the microbiology labs of our time, we're learning a lot about the microbes inside and on our bodies. And a classical approach to understand the relationship between the cheese microbes and the skin microbes would be to sequence everything and line up the sequences. But a synthetic approach was to go to the farm, get raw goat milk, go around campus, get microbial samples from the skin of your colleagues at Harvard, inoculate the milk, and make cheese using microbes sampled from human skin. All right, so the microbes found in the armpit of Daisy. What type of cheese, what type of goat cheese does that make? The microbes found on the toe of a philosopher, and so on. And this was all done within a few weeks. I don't know that the precautionary principle was applied. We didn't taste the cheese, we just smelled it when it was made. And so Daisy's armpit cheese had a robust floral sort of citrus bouquet, and you somebody in the room would have a better adjective. You'd have to invent a new adjective to describe how wrong the cheese made from the microbes found on the toe of a Harvard philosopher was. Click. So we're talking about worldview. Let me offer the aha moment for me from this project, this provocation. When I grew up, my mom said, eat your greens, treat your body as a temple, you are what you eat. This project flipped that around for me. Click. We eat what we are. That I have a potential for a very different type of relationship with the living world, and somehow growing up in the West and our food supply, which is focused on food safety and other things, has isolated and insulated me from these relationships. Next. So, for example, what might this mean? I don't know, but we had a group of teenagers earlier who had been dissatisfied with the bouquet of E. coli. It has a fecal bouquet, and they got rid of that and added in, as Jim alluded to, this big interest in flavors and fragrances, the biochemical pathways to make chemicals like methyl salicylate, which is wintergreen, or isoamyl acetate, which has a banana odor. What could you do with something like this? Next. Well, we live in a world right now where industrial centralized supply chains of plant inputs and petrochemical inputs are organized in factories, marketed with great expense, and shipped around physically as objects. So people buy this stuff and slather it on our skin so that we change our bouquet. Next. Imagine if I had a personal DNA synthesizer. You've got my phone, but imagine if that object could print DNA. And I could go to a website called iFumes, and I download the DNA code for 99 cents that encodes the biosynthetic pathways for making these different chemicals. And I print that DNA out on my phone, and I slather that DNA, transforming my microbial ecosystems on my skin, so I now have programmable living perfume that operates wherever I am. And the volatiles don't go away really quickly, it just can be remade. So I smell as I wish to smell for as long as the DNA is operating. Next. So Daisy Ginsburg, a colleague from the Royal College of Art in London, made an observation, I'm paraphrasing her. Is synthetic biology a revolutionary technology that must I promise to you that nothing will change? And I'll paraphrase this for my mom. You know, hey mom, we made the living world a lot more engineerable, but everything stayed the same. It's just kind of hard to believe that, right? So I don't mean this as a rhetorical question, but something you can reflect back, if you will. Next. I want to talk a little bit more about worldview. So I live in Silicon Valley, like right in the middle of Silicon Valley. It's where I work. And we hear a lot about exponentials and convergence. And so I want to talk about this worldview, because I'm learning that I really dislike it. So we have increased compute, Moore's law, exponential improvement in compute leading to AI and machine learning and who knows what. Increased reading of DNA, increased synthesis of DNA. All these things are coming together. Next. This gets described in different ways. A worldview proposed and accepted by many where I live is called the Singularity. And it's getting closer and closer and closer. That accelerated technical change and convergence of these different technologies will lead to a future that may leave us behind. And what that means exactly, who knows? Next. But how about these questions? Equity, fairness, meaning, citizenship. Am I a consumer of these technologies or am I a citizen of these technologies? Next. And just pause here for a second. So I just want to highlight a couple examples of where I now turn into a beggar, basically. Keynes, the British economist in the Depression, is writing on the economic possibilities of our grandchildren. And now those are the people who were around in 1990. So today it's great-grandchildren of Keynes. And basically observing, it's a bummer, this depression, that's an understatement, but don't worry, it's just a blip, and the economy will recover, and you can project the economic growth we could expect, and within 2 human generations, there'll be plenty of money for everybody. It's approximately what this essay says. And apparently his math is correct in terms of the economic growth. But by 1990 or today, how many people don't have to worry about money anymore? It's not the world we got, right? Very, very different world. So just because I can project a type of technical nerd rapture, it doesn't mean I'm going to get the society I want. Next. And so I'll make a different type of promise because I can relate what I've seen from the perspective of somebody operating inside the regime, so to speak, or the tribe. Here's the strategy in the United States for synthetic biology. It's called Industrialization of Biology, published by the US National Academies. Next. Here's the state of play from the United Kingdom. And the project in the UK go from the lab bench to the factory floor where industries in the future can create microscopic devices, safe, controlled way, and so on and so forth. So by default, I'm going to claim or promise to you that this is what we're going to get. We're going to get, and we are getting, industrialization of biology with better tools. Next. And we have enough experience collectively and individually to know that sometimes this doesn't always lead to what we want. In this case, runoff from agriculture and fertilization and so on. Next. And it was brought up earlier today, we've also, if you just give it a little click, there's a whole other part of the living world beyond humanity, right, that we might care about. And to contextualize this, I think about a year ago, approximately less than 1% of the practitioners of synthetic biology had ever heard of the IUCN or the Red List, period. All right, so if you want to talk about non-human biology, most people practicing in the space of modern biotechnology, although we're all dependent on the natural quote-unquote innovations we inherit from nature, very few people are aware of others representing the rest of the living world. Next. Okay, so what's our telos? Do we have a collective description of what we're aiming for? This is an example of a suspension bridge, a double-decker suspension bridge grown in place from the roots of a rubber plant in India. It gets stronger over time. It's passed down from one generation to the next. It fixes carbon. Click. So I'll make some observations. These could be debated, but I think they're pretty safe. Biology is in many places on our planet. It's harvesting energy through photosynthesis, about 90 terawatts, which is 4.5 times the energy our civilization runs on. It's pre-distributed. It grows, it heals, it's very functional, and it matters quite a lot. It has ramifications. So then, how do we want to partner with this? I'll take a stab at it. This is very debatable. Provide for all of humanity, stabilize and recover biodiversity, take infectious and other diseases off the table, enable a culture of citizenship around biology, not consumption, and understand more by building or tinkering. And I'd really value others showing up and constructively putting some stakes in the ground around these types of conversations. What is it that we wish to make true? Next. So here's a different metaphor. Click. I'll just click a couple times. Instead of this disenfranchising exponential and who knows where it ends up, I'm suspicious we can transition from a civilization where we were limited in our information, knowledge, and capacity to make stuff to a near civilization where we have an abundance of capacities for making and providing. And it's going to be unsettling, this transition. It's like going over a roller coaster and your stomach gets a little bit funny. And I can try and take a sense of where we might be. If you click, like what would it feel like at the top? So if I could make energy, and I can make sustainable energy with systems that generate more energy than they take to make, so I can just print energy, that'd be a sign that we're transitioning over that top. And I think we're there now for photovoltaic solar, but not many other types. Next. If I could have on-demand construction of organisms through the BioNet, if I had a global literacy rate of 1 in 100 people who were citizens of these technologies, I'm not quite sure what these are, but I suspect there's waypoints we could talk about if we liked a different worldview or metaphor for where we're aiming. I want to talk a little bit in closing about governance, if you will. So when we lose our way, the architecture of the system gets screwed up, then we rely on people being good, or at least not evil. If we can't count on goodness, then we have to rely on rules and regulations and morality. If that's lost, then we just indoctrinate people with ritual. And if that's lost, then it's chaos, the beginning of chaos. So depending on how you interpret this lesson, I think some of the conversations around governance are fantastically important and tactically necessary, but they're operating down at this level. And some of the people and organizations in the room, I'm sure, are much wiser than I in thinking about architecture of the system and other aspects of structuring relationships and landscapes within which people are behaving. Next. And I want to take the same ideas of precaution and apply it back to some of the moves that are being made. So I have 2 children, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And my mom was visiting from New Hampshire recently when our 1-year-old was showing up about a year ago. And she and our 4-year-old ate all our chocolate chips. And so being a mom, when she got back to New Hampshire, she went to the bakery in Norwich, Vermont, and bought chocolate chips and sent them to us as a replacement bag of chips. And labeling has, I think, come out of Maine of GM food and then been adopted by New Hampshire and Vermont and whatnot. So when I opened this up in the mail, next, I flipped it over, and for the first time I experienced labeling. regarding genetic engineering of food. For me, it's the first time I'd experienced that. So chocolate chips produced with genetic engineering. Now, it doesn't tell me what ingredient is genetically engineered. I think it's the soy, but I don't know. But here's the strange experience I had. Because you would think I'm biased to be like, cool, it's genetic engineering. But that's not the strange part of the experience. The strange part of the experience was chocolate chips. Yummy. Genetic engineering. Yummy. Chocolate chips. Yummy. Genetic engineering, yummy. And so now all of a sudden, I'm going, wow, the marketing of genetic engineering has been historically horrendous. We've never had the equivalent of Intel inside. And all of a sudden, these labeling laws are showing up, and I'm getting lots of tasty treats that are made with genetic engineering. So now all of a sudden, I think genetic engineering might be a tasty treat. I'm not saying that's the only outcome, but I'm just saying, hey, you know, there's unknown consequences of taking action. Next. Meanwhile, what do these creatures want? So just a couple more slides. I went for a hike in near San Gregorio Beach on the coast and just south of Half Moon Bay. And all of a sudden I saw this. I'd never seen this before, the 2 banana slugs. What is it that, what are they doing? What do they want? Well, isn't that just a whole, how do we feel about the language I'm using? Never mind paying attention to these organisms, but just the whole framework within which I'm experiencing these organisms. Next. So I want to highlight 2 essays in closing. There's a 1-page essay by Ursula Le Guin, published around 1985, called She Unnames Them. And Eve, biblical Eve, is the protagonist. And in this essay, Eve is going around and unnaming the species. So the yaks are debating. They're quite upset about losing their name, yak, right? But just think about the assumptions when we call something a yak or a cow or wheat, and how might synthetic biology change that framework, or how might you influence that framework? Next. And last. So there's an essay from 1992 by Greg Benford, a physicist and science fiction author, and I just want to highlight, it's called A Biological Century, ? And I just want to highlight the last paragraph. He states, the most extraordinary challenge ahead of us, however, will come from a brand new field which I call humanistics. It will involve specialists in artificial intelligence, evolution, computer languages around brain scientists, biotechnicians, and yes, even humanists. In the combined study of what it is to be human, we're going to have to hack out a definition of what human actually is, because the ability to produce things that look the same and walk the same, although they don't talk the same, may occur within the century. That will be the greatest challenge to our species, and I hope we don't have to face it before we work on the rest of the planet. Knowing, however, that God has not only a sense of humor, but a sense of irony, I expect we'll have to deal with both simultaneously. So my promises are that biology is amazing in nature. We're getting incrementally better at understanding it and tinkering with it. Those trends seem likely to continue. And that the puzzle of developing and implementing a biological strategy, no matter what type of organization you are, will be increasingly relevant. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Drew. And I wonder what you'll be saying to your grandchildren in the next 20 years or so, 10 years or so. You'll still be around to talk to them, hopefully. So, what can we do? What can we say? We could, I'm sure, have lots of questions, but we're going to go into a circle where we're going to have a circle discussion. Peter, yeah? You ready to take that over? We're going to have to get up and move tables to the side and then regroup the chairs, but I'll let, yeah. And then take your chairs and form a big circle.
Okay, thank you for forming a circle. Is everybody in the circle? Wonder if we could make that circle part a little more connected. Okay. It's an engineered circle. Okay, so this is a modified talking circle. Modified because, as I've been taught by a facilitator from Aboriginal traditions, it's you set out the question or the topic, and the talking stick passes to the left, and when you have the talking stick, you speak what's on your mind and on your heart. And if you prefer to pass, that's fine. You pass on the talking stick and move it to the next person. This one's a bit modified because we do have a few people who are prepared to share more of their story. So it's not only what's on your mind and your heart for everyone here. Hopefully we can make it around in an hour, in 90 minutes. This is a bit of a longer conversation. But just remind me, who are the people who are prepared to tell some stories about what this means and looks like on the ground? I think, Rebecca, you're one, is that right? Or not? Okay, yeah. Alejandrino, right? So Alejandrino, you're one? Yes. So when the talking stick comes to you, please take the time to tell the full story. Nemo?
Yes, please.
A bit more about what this looks like on the ground. When the stick comes. Okay. Anyone else who we've tapped earlier to share something that's prepared? Okay. So then let me send this talking stick on the way. It is from the Great Plains area. It was given to me as a gift by a person in Winnipeg. It does have the four colors of the four directions at the front, so maybe that's a bit of a memory of Bishop Mark's suggestions to us yesterday evening. All right, let me send it on its way to the left. What's on your mind and your heart? What are your questions for us as a whole? What are your wonderings about where this takes us? Rebecca?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I believe that you had
You need a mic or we can hear you.
presentation.
Yeah,
Code photos, no?
we do, yes, but I thought it was going to be at 3:30.
Well, between now, between 3 and 4:30 at some point. So we'll need the projector.
Okay, so maybe you can give the introduction to the story, and then after the talking circle, we can set it up so that you can actually do the presentation. Does that work well? Yeah.
So I thought it was thought out like that.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
great. Any other questions before we send this around to hear and listen to one another? Okay. Joanne, to you?
Hi, I'm Jordan, guys. I'm a tender here at TMM. I don't have too much on my mind because I missed quite a bit of the first bit, but from what I picked up, nothing's too specific, but it has my mind going. I'm from a farm family, and I grew up with a lot of, especially from my dad, a lot of, what's the word I'm going for? A lot of support for GMO and genetically modified foods and other things like that. So it's interesting for me to, that's too loud, let me know by the way. It's interesting for me to hear a whole bunch of different perspectives, because I definitely grew up with one perspective, and it was always based more or less in the welfare of the farmer and in food production. So it's interesting for me to go back and forth and know the perspective that I grew up with and hear from my parents is still pretty connected part of the farm community, and the more diverse effects of GMOs. So it's been an interesting been an interesting mind connection for me. That's all I got.
I'm not sure whether to pass this or not, to hold on to it. Well, this is such a beautiful stick. Has a lot of memories indeed. Yeah, I think just listening to all the conversations we've had since morning has raised a lot of issues in my mind and a lot of challenges about how we're going to have to confront the issues that are not just happening but will happen. And the very fact that a lot of these advances, in quotes, are happening in a very undemocratic manner. And the negative impacts would always be outsourced. It would be externalized. If one has the capacity to manipulate nature, I guess most people would try to do it to their own advantage. And if there are going to be negative advantages, negative impacts, that would be sent somewhere else. Over the past few weeks, I've been seeing a lot of emails concerning the genetically modified mosquitoes that are set to be released in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has become a testing ground for many terrible things. From the moment Thomas Sankara was assassinated about 20 years ago. While he was alive, that nation experienced real positive changes. And probably that was why he was assassinated. So genetically modified cotton was introduced to Burkina Faso, a country that produced the best cotton in Africa, the best quality, long fiber cotton. And they got output from the GMO cotton from Monsanto that had very short fiber, where they were promised economic gains. The farmers were losing money, and they cried out, and now genetically modified cotton has been outlawed, more or less, or discontinued in Burkina Faso. But now, genetically modified mosquitoes are coming to Burkina Faso, and from there may spread everywhere. So I was just wondering about this mosquito. Nobody wants to suffer from malaria, but is that the only, is genetically modified mosquito the only solution to malaria? That's a huge question. Just like the so-called treated net. Have you heard about the treated net that are given to people to sleep under? But most times people don't sleep, people don't live under nets. You're sitting under a tree, your family gatherings outdoors, you could stay late into the night, and then you go, before you go under the net to sleep, a couple of mosquitoes have had conversations with you. So, so some people have questions that are formulated so as to suit the answers that they have drawn up. And I think it's the same thing with synthetic biology. Trying to be faster than nature. Trying to make everything artificial, natural. And I guess, I don't know what the next thing is going to be. What would GMO 3.0 be? But from the last presentation, I was just thinking about the fact that God has a sense of humor and a sense of irony. So what would this irony be in the next dreams of scientists in the laboratory? And I'm going to pass a stick on, but one thing I'm convinced about is that nutrition is not something that comes from the laboratory.
one of the slides that Manuela presented this morning had a large number of organizations that are kind of connected to the issues we're talking about. And the one that jumped out at me was the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada's dealing with now, the churches are dealing with. And one of the articles in the Declaration is free, prior, and informed consent, which, as any number of lawyers who've studied and have been involved in drafting and writing the Declaration, does not mean a veto. It means free, prior, and informed consent. But what it does mean, and I think this is the tension, is Margaret Somerville, who some of you know is an ethicist, talks about science time and ethics time. And some of the questions that some of us are asking are really a generation old and haven't been, trying to keep up is quite difficult. So what would a process, if something that holds so much promise, look like if there was free, prior, and informed consent built into our regulatory system? What would the costs be of slowing down the extraordinary rapid pace of innovation? What impact would it have on potential promises that would serve the common good? What might we be able to do in reducing the potential harm? And can we do all of this without free, prior, and informed consent?
Well, I was struck in some ways by how positive the last presentation was, how promising this all looks. And what strikes me is that maybe this is a function in some ways of how urbanized our societies are. That when you have come a long distance from where things grow in the natural environment, where all of your environment is pretty much engineered, constructed, maybe, and where you are dependent in some ways, and this is one of the challenges that agriculture continues to name, is that most people live in urban areas, so we farmers have to be more and more productive because there are going to be more and more people who rely on us for food and so on and so forth. That somehow those distances and that urbanization makes this seem not only feasible, but somehow positive. And I find myself baffled by that. So I think our location somehow skews our thinking about this. We are like the plant you showed us this morning. We somehow, when we're constrained in where we live, the roots of our thinking reorganize themselves also.
A lot to think about. Some of the things that I come back to, we're looking into the future with a lot of this, so I think that's always a challenge. And I don't want to believe hype on either side of this, either hype about the worst possibilities or hype about the best ones. I think a lot of this could be overblown marketing from the industry. So what actually comes to pass is a big question that I still hold. I'm very conscious of how the profit motive is at play in so much of this, and so often when we're hearing about potential outcomes like preventing the spread of malaria, my thought goes to, are there low technology or no technology fixes that could be used instead of this techno fix? And if so, Is that not being promoted because it's not making money, or why is that not being promoted more? At the same time, I like technology, and I've benefited from technology, and I live in an urban setting, so I'm not afraid of technology, and I'm conscious of not rejecting things offhand or just feeling some sense of disgust and just wanting to distance myself from something like synthetic biology. So I'm really interested in grappling with these questions, and I think it's important to have conversations that don't just involve one viewpoint. So I'm really thankful that Drew in particular is here, because I've been part of a lot of other work where it's very difficult to get people with differing viewpoints into the same room talking to each other, and I think that's really, really important.
I know. Yeah. Okay. Sí, tú me dices, okay. No, pero tú. I'm just the lips. I'm that puppet, you know. Ándale. Oh, it's very kind. Thank you.
Aún con toda esta plática, sigo sin comprender entonces si la biología sintética en este caso será bueno o será malo para algún futuro.
Even after all this talk, I'm still wondering whether synthetic biology will be good or bad for the future.
Sin embargo, en este momento, en mi región, en mi comunidad, en donde somos productores de vainilla, esta introducción o este nuevo modelo no ha sido para nada benéfico para nosotros.
However, in my region, where we grow vanilla beans, the introduction of this new technology has not been beneficial for the community. It hasn't been good for us.
Ha rompido con todo un esquema social, cultural, comunitario e incluso familiar, y sobre todo de convivencia y enseñanzas para cultivar la vainilla.
Basically, the introduction of this technology has broken with the web, the social web, interfamiliar, and at the community level that is required to grow vanilla traditionally. So the introduction has not turned a positive outcome in the wider sense.
Es impresionante ver cómo las grandes extensiones de vainillales o de vainilla con el paso del tiempo han empezado a desaparecer.
It's impressive to see how these wide extensions of vanilla rows have started to disappear over time.
De aquella región totonaca, sobre todo de Papantla, conocida como la ciudad que perfumaba al mundo, ahora solo queda el recuerdo.
Out of that Totonaca region, known as the city that gave perfume to the world, that is to say the vanilla, to the world, there's only now a memory.
La biología sintética o los productos biológicamente modificados han entrado con gran fuerza a México.
Synthetic biology and genetically modified crops have entered Mexico with great strength.
Lo impresionante de todo es que no hay ni leyes ni reglamentos que impidan su introducción a nuestro país.
What's most impressive is that we don't have any rules or laws to prevent that from happening.
Y es entonces en donde hemos decidido que culturalmente tenemos que resistir a pesar de esta situación.
Therefore, we have decided that despite this situation, we have to resist.
Y es entonces aquí en donde hemos empezado a cultivar nuevamente la vainilla desde una visión más cultural, tradicional y de preservación y de amor hacia la planta, y no como un producto que nos pueda dejar grandes ganancias económicas.
And this is how we decided to go back to growing vanilla in the traditional manner, to get all the social benefit and to get back to the relationship we kept with the plant, not with the aim of greater monetary benefit, but for the benefits that we have gained from that relationship with the plant.
Ahora bien, lo importante sería es cómo poder llegar o llevar mayor información a las comunidades de los productos sintéticos, que finalmente no es un tema muy conocido en la región.
Now, the next step would be to bring more information to other communities so that they can make an informed decision in terms of this synthetic biology and genetically modified foods.
Hemos intentado de varias maneras preservar la planta de la vainilla, desde malla sombra para una producción más grande, pero finalmente hemos notado que no ha funcionado.
We tried this new method, it's called malla sombra, to grow the vanilla plant, but we noticed that it does not work. Just so you know, malla sombra, it means that there's a web that creates, casts some sort of like shade onto the plant. So it's called malla, which is net, and sombra, shade.
Y es por eso que hemos decidido regresar a un cultivo más tradicional, en el que no tengamos que modificar nuestra propia naturaleza.
So we decided to go back to the traditional way of doing things so that we don't have to modify even our own nature.
Y así como en mi comunidad, hay otras más en las que nos hemos empezado a organizar para hacer un cultivo conjunto en el que podamos transmitir nuevas enseñanzas a las futuras generaciones.
And so that's how we have organized with other communities so that we can transmit this wisdom through several generations.
Y es por eso que se ha optado generar un banco de semillas en el que se pueda preservar a largo tiempo los productos que están en peligro de extinción.
And one of those initiatives involves the creation of a seed bank so that this wealth can be preserved from any contamination, if possible.
Y es aquí en donde hemos empezado a ver que la gente de la comunidad, a pesar de que no tienen la información sobre la biología sintética, está interesada en preservar sus recursos, en preservar sus semillas, en preservar su propia naturaleza.
We notice that people are very willing to preserve their seeds, preserve their wealth, and preserve their own nature.
Entonces yo pido a ustedes que puedan mirar también hacia el campo, hacia la cultura, que la biología sintética no es solamente algo que se va a fabricar, sino más bien todo el efecto que trae con ello. Es decir, que estamos en peligro de extinción no solamente las plantas, sino también como personas y como humanos.
So I ask you to look at the bigger picture and consider that anything that is done to nature is done to ourselves. And it's not only the plants that might be in danger of becoming extinct, but ourselves as well.
Gracias.
Thank you. Okay, so how's this? Oh, me too? Okay. No. Thank you.
And I'm sorry for just arriving this afternoon, but to hear this and feel kind of overwhelmed by what I'm hearing in that one presentation, I keep thinking of the questions, and what I'm hearing around the circle brings them back to mind. Those, and maybe they've already been said in the times I haven't been here, but like sort of who's paying, who's profiting, who's getting hurt, and who's benefiting, and those basic analysis questions. But how do we get a chance to kind of do that discernment before it's gone, before the train's gone down the track, and we, beyond our ability to answer those questions in a way that allows us to pull back in the way I hear you're doing? Those are the questions that are in my mind.
On the one hand, I feel great excitement about this whole synthetic biology thing. You know, when I was a kid, I loved playing with Lego blocks and making things. And I remember at one point, somebody I knew got these blocks with batteries and motors, and they actually moved. That was even cooler. It's like it's alive, you know. And now I hear that there are these bio blocks, and that you can, you're constructing a living organism, which is even more exciting. On the other hand, I feel a great sort of trepidation about the whole thing, knowing, just having a very simple, superficial knowledge, but still a knowledge nonetheless of how complex and interwoven our whole ecosystems are. And just thinking, you put something in there that you've changed, maybe it won't do anything bad, but you just not wanting to mess that up and not wanting to do anything that could damage the sort of delicate web of life that we have. So on the one hand, I find it all really exciting. On the other hand, I'm very aware and concerned about the danger. So I'm just grappling with that and thinking about that, and I will be thinking about that for probably a long time.
When I very first started looking at genetics, one of my uncles, who was a well-known Angus breeder, said, he had been following the Angus genetics his entire career. And he said, JD, remember, if we can do it in cows, we can do it in people. Cows are more difficult than people, he actually argued. And so, as we, look at these things, I'm very much a technological optimist. I was the 16th child in the United States to have the top of his head cut off and replaced with plastic, because I had a kind of microcephaly, and it worked mostly. So I'm not undissuaded that we can do things well, but I want to make sure we do them right. There are lots of different ways of doing things, and we need to figure out what is the right way of doing those things. My uncle died from cancer. My cousin, his son, died from cancer. At their funerals, everybody said Monsanto killed them because they were using these GMO crops to feed their cows. So I'm not forever in the day opposed to these things, but I want to make sure we do it right, and that we have better odds than I did when I was a baby. I had 50-50 odds of surviving that operation. I want to make sure we have 99% odds of doing it right, and maybe better.
Looking at those slides and hearing about the promises of synthetic biology and the short paragraph from Maynard Keynes that things were going to get much better after the depression of the 30s, that the wealth would be there. But it seems that that sharing of the wealth is not what's happening. And I don't think Silicon Valley has a very good history of sharing the wealth. There's even more discrepancy and spread. The 1% is richer and richer all the time. So that the sharing of whatever we come up with technology, synthetic biology, seems to be the profit motive. Making money is what pushes the discoveries.
My ideas run along lines that several people have already expressed, so I won't dwell on them, but I would like to take them right back to Drew's very first promise. As soon as I saw it, my heart grew rather anxious and my head grew rather confused. So the fact that we're going to get better, I'm quoting it, better at tinkering, right, with biology. I'd really substitute for better. Drew was very fair, he put better in quote marks, but I would say competent, and there's no question about that. That's just not up for dispute. It's going to happen. Science will do whatever science can do. Better, however, while competent can be measured inside the domain of science, better is an ethical word. And there, the dialogue, I think, is not happening, and I think it has to happen. I think both sides are a bit at fault. I think especially the theological, but also the general ethical and humanist community has allowed itself to get way behind on this issue, and they should have been able to see it coming already from the time of Luther Burbank, way back at the beginning of the 20th century. So we have not really faced up to this issue and entered into the dialogue. The fault on the other side is the capacity to do whatever can be done. And the sooner the better, because that's how you get Nobel Prizes. When I first started studying theology, one of the very first ideas I was taught, first principles I was taught, is that you don't try to storm heaven. And if we're going to talk about better in an ethical sense, then instead of, and I did hear this a lot in the talk, instead of doing whatever we can do and then let's see what comes out and surprise, we instead try in conscience to understand the telos, to understand why we're doing it, and work toward that good end. And so that's where I think the dialogue really, really has to go. And if we're going to work in conscience, I think we have to keep Elijah in front of our eyes. You remember there was the thunderstorm and the wind and the loud noise, and God was not in those things. and you had to wait to hear the still small voice, and then you knew what God was asking you to say.
I think I'll blog.
We were sitting in the front last night after it ended, and I said to those gathered how I didn't feel that I don't see it how it impacts me personally, and I'm a doer and I need to get things in the ground and see them grow and see that physically happen for me to believe it or understand it, I guess. And I still feel a little bit like that. And these issues are so big and that I have a hard time putting them into my daily life. But I feel very grateful that we are here and that we are creating the connections. You know, Alejandrino, understanding where you're coming from, having Drew here, those little connections make it more real for me. And so I'm very thankful for that.
So a couple of things were going through my head to do with human error some of the time. That's not always the best way to come at a question. But a long time ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I lived very near the Royal Botanical Gardens. And so there are millions of trees, not an exaggeration. And they were being attacked by gypsy moths. And if you've ever seen that happen to a tree, you know it's a really very sad sight. But the response was to spray the whole area, and I can't remember the chemical that was used. So many of our houses were in the spray path. And so on a certain day, there was a notice that you made sure you stayed inside, or you weren't at home, or your children weren't around, your animals were inside the house, whatever. But nobody asked us. Nobody talking about free or informed consent. And so it was wonderful to think that the botanical gardens were being preserved. But I mean, we're talking about a very busy area, highly residential. And it did strike me that the human element was being kind of left out there. And that's always a problem as far as I'm concerned. It's not a question of balance so much, but it seemed to me one area was being chosen over another. And in that same area, so it maybe says something about where I live, but there's very many golf courses. And also about 5 or 6 years ago, they were besieged by swarms of aphids. So if you were going up and down playing golf, you could hardly see, you couldn't talk because you would be breathing in these aphids. And it's not a very pleasant experience. If anybody's been to Scotland and you know what midges are like, except they bite as well. But it's really unpleasant. But again, as a response, they brought in ladybugs, because ladybugs eat aphids. But the particular type of ladybug they brought in was from outside Canada, and they were the flying bugs that actually bite. So they did deal with the aphids, but anybody who was out in the golf course then was treated to biting ladybugs. And so it seemed to me that it's a classic example of you use something from outside your locale, and it doesn't necessarily have the effect that people at the beginning think it would have. But by then, of course, it's really too late. So that idea of not knowing and yet trying to find a solution, but the solution doesn't work, that goes on in human nature all the time. I've been thinking about healthcare a lot, and maybe especially synthetic biology in terms of the human, but also in terms of artificial intelligence and where those might be connecting over the next decade. And if you've been around healthcare recently, you'll know there's an increased roboticization of medicine. So healthcare being delivered through artificial intelligence, if you like. So being faced by a robot asking you questions and answering, sometimes through a kind of telemedicine setup, but still it's not a face-to-face encounter. And I find that this just strikes me as being so anti-care and anti-human, and it may have its place in some remote areas, I don't doubt that, but the way in which it's going bothers me very much. And it's the same idea, again, it's almost an experiment, but it's not going away. It's going to, everything we read, artificial intelligence is going to be more and more prevalent, and so underscoring that as well as questions in synthetic biology, I just realize we have an awful lot to deal with.
I worked for about 30 years in environmental assessments of infrastructure and transportation projects. I worked with many engineers who were wonderful people, most of them, and most of them human. Very good. For 30 years, it was a struggle to convince them that straightening out a river and putting concrete into the base of it wasn't really the best thing for anyone. Because in the end, the river would flow back to its course. The river was just not understood. The question of what is a river was not understood. But during those 30 years, they did get better at tinkering with rivers, so that they no longer put concrete in its base. They straightened them, but they didn't do the worst to them that they could have. They straightened them minimally for their projects and did some mitigation to provide better fish habitat and to do some plantings around them. But the fundamental question of what a river was never really understood. My concern I carry throughout the lectures and the talks and the conversations we've had is we're not really sure what a human being is. We're not really sure where our thoughts come from, where our feelings come from, what our motivations derive from. So to say that we might have a better understanding of what a human being is, I think is a long, long way off. And without that understanding, how do we tinker with this genetic material?
One thought that has come to me during our time together and kind of somehow crystallizing, I don't know if I can formulate it very well, but is that on the one hand we can address what we see as problems or issues more from, I'll call it from the center, for kind of a centered fixing perspective, where we tackle the problem head on and try to fix it so that it stays the way it is and has that kind of continuity of having solved a problem, eradicated something. And personally, I think there are many places in the world where that's justified, many activities, human activities. But there's something complementary to that I think is just as necessary if we're going to have a hope of doing things that are healthy and whole, which is the other side, more from the periphery to the center, which is this more the character of orchestrating situations to see how one could help then that which one sees as problematic go through a change. So, I mean, if I take a problem that we're not discussing here, the opioid epidemic in the United States, there are attempts to look at how can we fix this problem? But it's so clearly a problem of human beings being in particular kinds of contexts that then where this, I mean, if you could say if there are no opioids in the world, then they would maybe choose some other way of trying to get out of their misery. So what needs to be done from the context that allows this problem, I'm not going to say to disappear by itself, but that the people could come into a different kind of situation. Or in gardening, how we tend the soil and the water, and then planting the seeds, and then the plants do their work, right? So that from the periphery to the center. And I think these two complementary aspects, you have to worry about your seeds, but you worry about your context. Without those both of those, where I don't feel we can have really something has the promise of health. So that it's good to look for that. If one sees one's working in a way that's one-sided, which is probably, we all do that, then to take the exercise and say, well, what would be the complement of that in order to make it more whole? So I would think, Drew, it would be great if all of your students who were doing the synthetic biology, in as much as they're doing that, they would need to go out into nature and study those salamanders that you showed, right? Without that, I would have a really hard problem saying, I want to give these young people responsibility to change the world, because they don't know the world. Because they don't know the world they're changing in another way, right? That makes it whole. So that's a thought.
Oh, as some of you know, I've been on a crusade around glyphosate and Roundup. I'm not a scientist, but I'm with a lot of people who are dying. And so all I'll say is Marge Perry said she used to handle it with her bare hands gardening because they were all told it was safe. So she died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she said, do something. I thought, well, I guess I'll start to find out more about this. But the point here is, maybe there are benefits, but what happens when the Monsantos rule the world, and meanwhile there's high rates of cancers, at least in the areas where I know it's been applied. And I just put that out, saying that holds me back from, I suppose, even taking a more open or beneficial view towards what's coming or what is around biotechnology.
I guess what struck me about this conference this weekend has been the fact that we have been sitting in circles since we got here. And how often do we sit in circles and have a conversation one with another about what we think, where our fears are, our hopes, our prayers? And my sense of hope in all of this is that we are talking one to another, we are connecting to each other in relationship, and that is the most powerful thing we have to move this work forward.
Oh dear. I guess I just wanted to say that I get to see people who are working with this technology. I work in a kids' hospital, so I do get to see people who are driven not by the profit motive, but by the fact, say, that their best friend's kid has muscular dystrophy, and they're using CRISPR to modify mice so that they can work on MD. Just that we need to be, and it's not an uncomplicated question at all, the use of SynBio, but how we keep dialogue going and look for the positives and how to help shape our future.
I just want to say how grateful I am to be here and to be part of this, and to be able to take part in it. I've been dealing with chronic fatigue for the past few years, so I didn't know if I'd managed to make it here or if I'd managed to make it through a talk or to be part of it. So I'm really grateful for that, and sort of just a little bit relating to that, sort of having a couple years of just being very careful about my energy and thinking about where my energy goes, and being someone who's interested in sort of democratic processes of decision making around new and emerging technologies. And I'm always saying that, like, you know, the publics like need to be involved, and there need to be discussions. And so I'm really glad this is happening, and also I'm aware, you know, don't want you to just have to expend a lot of energy, sort of to no end. So first of all, I think Jenny's point about relation building is really important. Like, to me, just getting together and having these conversations in itself, I think, is of value, even if it doesn't go to and change the Canadian government. But then also, I think, I really resonated with what Drew said about how all of our communities, we need to have our biostrategy, right? And so maybe, you know, the Canadian Council of Churches biostrategy doesn't need to have all the answers of how to do synthetic biology. Maybe it's around questions of power relations. Maybe it's around questions of who benefits, et cetera. Or maybe it's around process. Maybe it's about who needs to be listened to in these debates. Yeah.
For some reason, every few months, Jesus chooses to put me in a room with Mark McDonald and get reminded about four-directional thinking. And I'll say I feel very called to that, and have been very blessed by the wisdom of how that's altered conversations. And I'm humble enough to know that it's a call to something that I don't fully understand, which is a call to listen, and a call I hear in the respect for cultures. I want to say that I was deeply touched by Craig's statement that we're emphasizing the things that we understand, and we're dampening down the things that we don't understand. And like, that's a profound way, I think, to look at the choice we're making, perhaps not just in synthetic biology, but when we do other places. I'm also reflecting a lot on the church that I know best. The church that I know best is kind of scared of this conversation. They're scared of the science language. They're scared of the risks, and I don't think we're at our best when we're scared, and so I think there needs to be a way of managing the fear as we're honest about the risks. The church I know best has also been very touched by newness in our culture. I think the iPhone 10 came out recently. Apparently that's big news. Which is to say that if something's new, we're just fascinated by it, and that's touched the people in my church a lot. I think the church that I know best is at risk of not doing four-dimensional thinking by spiritualizing everything rather than talking about the conversation being a four-directional kind of thing. And I also think we're sometimes at risk of wanting to control or be in charge of the conversation, and I don't think that's a very healthy motivation for that. So I have been really blessed by a sentence or two of profound thoughts from so many different speakers, and I feel there's some really good challenge to what the church can bring to the conversation, and we've got some humble, listening, good homework to do that in a good way.
One way to describe my profession is I imagine fantasies. I try and live in different worlds, and then I return to what I experience and attempt to reconcile what could be true or made true or should be made true, and it's almost impossible to feel better than I'm shooting from the hip, or I'm part of something that's constrained by extrinsic factors, and then what? A simple physics experiment, which may have no bearing on this, but I'll share it, is when you have a vacuum, the absence of something in a space, and there's other things around it, the vacuum will over time tend to be filled with something. And that metaphorically in this context has made it hard for me to walk away, to stop being part of something. And what I'm most grateful for is whatever it's called, whether it was called synthetic biology or shiny happy biology or the worst case scenario, it's brought us here. And to the extent that that allows for a shaping of context, the environment, the structuring of the environment that then biases or directs what arises, there's a lot that could be done together that'd be at least different, and who knows if it'd be better. But a computer is not a computer is not a computer. It depends on the details. It depends on who has it or doesn't have it. And so it is with other things. And I think the people and organizations represented here have tremendous capacity to shape the landscape within which things are happening. And I'm hopeful those voices are, I'm really sympathetic and nervous about costs of participating, just the energy and resources involved to get engaged and whatnot. But if the nooks and crannies or points of leverage can be found, I'm hopeful from that basis.
There's so much flying around in my head. First of all, I would like to thank Drew very much for being here. You have added enormously. I think it's very brave of you to be here, and I think it gives a level of reality to our discussion that we wouldn't have if you weren't here. So I really want to thank you for being here. I was trained as a physician, and one of the things physicians look at are vital signs. And the vital signs of the earth are grim. First single most important vital sign is CO2 in the sky, and it's just climbing. Population shouldn't be, well, the population has tripled in my lifetime. And we have all the other things, loss of topsoil, ocean acidification, and the sixth major extinction of species. I stand up and say things when maybe I shouldn't, but I'm going to say this. I don't think we're going to survive. I don't think our species is going to make it. But I think I know that in a way that may be true, may not be true, but it doesn't matter. Because what counts, I think, is to face the challenges that we have today and do the best we can today. And what may happen in the future will come. It'll come. I have been thinking about the spiritual aspects of synthetic biology for 5 years, and nothing came to me until on the plane out here from Vancouver. All of a sudden, it fit together. I think our species has been in a major, undeclared, unintentional war with life. And I think it's been that way for several hundred years. And what drives that is actually quite reasonable, I think, consumption. So a lot of the consumption, for some people, has been quite unreasonable, even several hundred years ago. But it's really unreasonable now. And I was delighted to look at what Quakers have been doing recently about peace, because one of the major components of what the Quakers are doing now about peace is addressing inner peace. And I think the one antidote that I can think of in relation for consumption is inner peace. If you want to sell something, make people uneasy. When people are really at peace, I think, are much less likely to overconsume. And I think people who have a capacity to be at peace are people of faith, to be deeply at peace. And I think this is an extraordinary gathering. There are a lot of things I'm not sure of, but one of the things I am sure of is that gathering like this, looking at a very difficult conversation, is the right thing to do.
It's great to be in the circle with all of you thoughtful and caring people. I guess one thing I would just kind of echo back is I think we do have an important voice to offer as one of the perspectives, and I heard it mentioned in different ways, but this telos is about health and wholeness and about humility and love. And I think we're kind of young as a species, and we're trying to figure this out, and we still get very intoxicated by new technologies and fantastic ideas, at the same time that the systems that take advantage of these are based in very primal emotions like selfishness and greed. So it's a bad recipe, the two of those together, given a lack of kind of maturity and wisdom by the species. So I think people of faith do have an important voice, important perspective to add to the debates. And I think we also have a dedication to lift up the voices that are not heard and to find common cause with those who are being hurt by the systems and the systems of power and politics that take advantage of both new natures to exploit, including new technologies like synthetic biology. So yeah, I'm hopeful that we will be engaged. I think it's an important conversation to be having for all of us, and to bring back to our people to raise up and to bring voice to.
Thank you. Just a couple of reflections from me too. I was mentioning earlier to I think to you, Andrew, but just maybe 100 years ago when folks were developing the engine, the motor, and that ran on fossil fuels, and they externalized the exhaust of that, they didn't realize then that the cumulative effects over a few generations might contribute to climate change and a planet-wide challenge for all of humanity, or all human and non-human living organisms. So now we've got organic production engines, and I'm wondering to what extent that externalization factor, again, might play a role some generations from now, and what that might look like. Those are some wonderings, questions, I guess, on my mind. But it also illustrates for me that I'm beginning to see, thanks to some of your comments, Nemo, and a few other things too, that this is an ecological justice issue. Like climate change is an ecological justice issue. It fits in that same category. We sometimes, maybe at the Canadian Council of Churches only, maybe elsewhere, we sometimes use that as a euphemism really for climate change work or other kinds of wilderness preservation kinds of things, but I think actually this is maybe in that same category. We try to show up at the COP climate change conferences, but we haven't been showing up at the COP Convention on Biodiversity conferences. Maybe they ought to be at the same level of political advocacy and engagement and relationship building. Something that comes to mind. The other thing is maybe I really was intrigued by Drew's, I think second to the last slide, which I would love to look at a little longer, which I think laid out some principles for thinking about it, maybe even theological or value-based principles for thinking about the work. And I've always appreciated, I guess maybe that's part of my personality or experience, I do appreciate having a set of 6 or 8 principles to kind of start my reflection thinking on. And I would love to see us do some more work on what those are, what those might be. Martin Luther King said that the universe bends toward justice. The arc of the universe bends toward justice. I think it was Jacques Maritain who also said that the arc of the universe bends toward more complexity, to flourishing, to expansion. And we're certainly seeing that. But then the challenge becomes, how do we participate in that in a responsible way to God and to each other? Well, a few reflections from my end. So I'm looking at Anne and thinking, this is a meeting room, so maybe we should keep silence for a couple of minutes. And then I understand that there's still maybe one more presentation yet before we close out the afternoon, because you've come prepared with that, so we'll organize ourselves to participate in that, and then it'll be the closing, I think, right, Anne? Yeah. So a couple of minutes. That's right. So we'll keep silence for a couple of minutes.
I'm wondering if the presentation might be better first thing tomorrow morning when we've got the tables all back and people sitting around the table? Or would you like to do it now where we'd have to? We can still sit here, okay. If you, all right. Have we got it? Do you want to do it now? Let's, okay. You want? Well, people want to do it now, if you're up to doing it now. I don't know if it's set up or not. No, I'm saying, have you got the PowerPoint set up? No. So, well, you could set it up while we do the announcements or housekeeping things, maybe. No?
Sorry, we're just.
Yes, sir. Or we can do it tomorrow morning. See? Okay. Because then the tables will be back. Mañana. Mañana. But we must remember, for us, mañana. So, I think it's been a great day. I'd like to thank Jim and Craig, I'm going to miss people. Jim and Craig and Manuela and Deborah and Drew and all of us for the contribution. There's so many people to thank. I just realized that we never actually got the planning committee to stand up. The people who were planning this thing. So could you stand up and get a... Lucy, yeah. And there's 3 people not here. Manoj was one, we heard about that. Michael Buttry, who was with the Anglican Church and is out in Calgary. And Tracy Trotham, who's with the United Church and had an emergency appendectomy, so she wasn't able to come with us. But I just wanted to thank everybody. Now, before comments about tonight, there's some sign-up sheets which people have signed their names on for supper at a restaurant down beside the Y at 87 Elm Street. There are other people who've signed up for supper here because there's lots of food left over and we can get all the food out and you can sit around the dining room table and it could be very, very nice. And then there's, for other people that don't want to do either of those things, then you are on your own. You can walk down to Dundas and find dozens of little restaurants that you might want to try. To get down to the public meeting, you can walk. It's half an hour. You go now, you'll still have the sun. If you don't want to walk because you're talking or eating or whatever, there are tokens and you don't have change and you want to don't have to be bothered with what is the TTC. If you're young, you take a little one, it's a token. If you're not young, you take an older one, which is a bigger one, which is a toonie. To get you down to the Dundas subway stop. And then there are instructions in your and you can take 2 if you want to get the subway back. When they run out, they run out. Does anybody, Ginny?
If anyone would like to share a cab down,
okay.
Parking down there is crazy. Please come and see me. I would like that because the parking is crazy downtown. So.
Now, don't take a car downtown. St. Patrick's at Dundas, yeah. Does anybody want to say something about the tonight? Tracy or Matt or 7 o'clock down at 87 Elm Street. Be there or be squared. Any other couple of? You look as if you're wanting to say something. I know you're coming. Yep. Okay, no more, that's it. Okay, Stephen is going to close us for this part with a reflection and or a prayer. And then you're on your own till we reconvene at a restaurant or at the public meeting.
So I've been asked to share a few reflections, which I entitled Some Reflections, Inadequate as They Will Be, trying to capture much of what has been said today. But I was thinking about what Bishop Mark MacDonald said last night, or one of the many things he said, and he said the challenge for us is to find the path of human flourishing, or as Indigenous people will often say, to ensure we walk in a good way, with a good heart. So with these words, here's some reflections from a very intensive day. I'm not immersed in synthetic biology, so there was much that I heard today that was new. Trying to understand it and then struggle, what are the questions that need to be asked? So one of the questions is, what impact is synthetic biology having or may have on marginalized people? And when I think about climate change, that those who produce the least amount of CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, I'm thinking about Inuit communities in the north, suffer disproportionately. And that would be true in the global south as well. So there is an issue of power at stake here. We've gone from GMO 1.0 to GMO 2.0. I didn't know we'd gone to 2.0. That DNA can be read faster and in a larger quantity, and that the costs are dropping and will continue to drop. In 2020, the industry will be worth somewhere in the range of $38 billion. And the research funding is coming from many sources, and what jumped out at me, and I wondered why, from the defense industry in the United States. What does that mean, and what are the implications? The products can be made in vats, whether they're flavors or fragrances or food. And in some cultures, the relationship with food is spiritual. What is the impact on smallholders in the global south who might be producing vanilla or some other product? And there was that quote, "Step aside, cocoa farm. Synthetic biology is on the way." Now that could be received in a good way or a more ominous fashion. I think one of the issues is the potential of gene drive in eradicating human malaria. Why wouldn't we want that? Hundreds of thousands of people suffer and thousands die each year in Africa. But it may be one issue that needs some careful analysis and regulation is gene drive. So what are the risks? We were reminded this morning that a plant is more than its constituent parts, but its relationship to its ecosystem. It kind of reminded me of the South African notion of Ubuntu. I am more than who I am because of you and the community that I'm part of. I think it was helpful for me to hear about the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. I'm not sure how powerful they are, but if they weren't there, what would that mean? And so they're vital for countries that don't have the capacity to regulate, that don't have the scientific capacity. And maybe one of the principles ethical principles I was reflecting on is the whole idea of participation as an important ethical principle. We heard of many promises, and one of them was the continuing industrialization of biology. And I'll think about that. And then what level of governance do we need? Is morality adequate? And finally, we need to develop a bio-strategy. And I think that's an issue for those of us in the Canadian Council of Churches. Much, much more was said, but that's what my small brain could absorb today. The prayer I have is from the Iona community, an ecumenical community in Scotland, and it's called, the prayer book is called Dirt, Mess, and Danger, Liturgies and Worship Resources. And I'm not sure, I picked this prayer several days ago, so I'm not sure it really fits with what we heard today. I leave that to you. But let us gather for a moment. And the prayer is called the Hamper of Creation. The Hamper of Creation. When you made the hamper of creation and filled it with your love, you intended there to be enough for all, enough space for all, enough food for all, enough justice for all, enough security for all, and that always each should have their rightful place beneath the sun. But we know not all are prepared to be careful and wise with their demands. And so the hunger of many and the poverty of many, because of the callous wastefulness of many and the unnecessary deprivation and hardship, we store up for our children and our children's children. Teach us to treat this world as our friend as it keeps us alive and supports us, sustains our living and makes good our days, helps us to realize it is just plain and downright stupid to bite the very hand that feeds us, and gather for now as if there were no tomorrow to be lived. May we make good choices, rooted in the solid rock and sure foundation of your sensible and crucial word of life, and not the shifting sands of selfishness. Creator God, hear the cries of this broken earth and its broken people. Listen to these cries, and in your mercy, heal and mend, and gift us with courage and with wisdom. Amen.